Hi, Jennifer Byrne here, moving through the sin cycle, though it would be inappropriate to be too excited about it because tonight's sin is sloth, the quiet and reluctant achiever of sins. Also, the last to get on the board. The original sin, it's interesting this, it was sadness, a sort of spiritual idleness, and it was only around the 17th century that it got rebadged as sloth, though the punishment of being thrown into a pit of snakes remained the same. Too harsh, maybe? Well, we'll be discussing this with, if I may introduce my four very different guests, starting with the human torpedo, statesman, memoirist, blogger, and Pilates obsessive, the high-achieving and perfectly sculpted Bob Carr. By his side, Hannah Gadsby, comedian, art lover, TV presenter, and don't let that productivity fool you. This is a woman who likes a good lie down now and then, and she claims she actually works in bed. Sure you do, Hannah. Gary Steingart is a New Yorker who makes the best, funniest, and definitely most star-studded videos to promo his books, including Super Sad True Love Story, which in fact we featured on this show when it was published a couple of years back, and his current memoir, Little Failure, in which he appears absolutely unforgettably with James Franco in matching fluffy pink dressing gowns. And it was fabulous, Gary. And finally, the venerable Robina Courtin, a woman who has already had several lives before becoming one of Australia's leading Buddhist teachers, who will, I am sure, bring us some wisdom on the subject of sloth. So won't you please welcome them all. Now, as I said, this is the fourth sin we've discussed. A couple of the others, we've started with Homer. In the case of wrath, we started with the Iliad. With the Odyssey, we started with pride. But with this, I thought we'd start with another Homer. We'd start with Homer Simpson. Because I think, is there any better modern summation of the nature of sloth than his observation, what is the point going out, you just wind up back here again? Recognisable, Hannah?
Yeah. I wouldn't say he's necessarily a sloth, though, because he has passion. He's very passionate about food, and one of the things about sloth is that you don't really care, and you can't say that about Homer. He gets excited about food.
Would you define the sin through a negative? It's what you don't do is sloth.
Yeah, pretty much. You're just empty inside. I think in his case, his slothfulness is the byproduct of his greed.
Ah, so he's guilty of another sin.
Yeah.
That happens.
Yeah, it does.
Bob, is this familiar to you, the whole notion of Homer Simpson? I could mention Garfield the cat, another lazy character.
No, I think I've seen Homer Simpson once, but wasn't driven to go back, to set my clock and go back and see it another time.
Because, I mean, I would like to bring forward one, because I think, again, the particularity of sloth is there is one pillar, one literary pillar, one titan, which is the book Oblomov, which was written in the 1850s by a Russian. Would you agree he is the epitome of sloth?
Yeah, Oblomov is a wonderful book by a fellow named Ivan Goncharov. It's fun to say that name. And Oblomov spends most of the book on his sofa. Sometimes he punches his manservant Zakhar, but he basically doesn't move very much. And he complains when his servant says, you know, you have to go out and woo a woman, or you have to go and be productive. There's even a Russian word, Oblomovshchina, which means the state of being Oblomov. And when people describe all the problems of Russia, they will say it's Oblomovshchina, the fact that people don't move much from their sofa.
Yeah, I think it's got to be considered seriously as one response to a view that every action ends up with unintended consequences, and people are going to assume that all social engineering, for example, ends up failing. And one response to this is simply to devote your life to doing nothing. But reading the book, you do want to take him by the lapels of his oriental dressing gown with its egg stains and soup stains, that's right, and shake him into doing something, going out and jogging along the Neva, or reading one of those books cover to cover that has been open for a month and
because he does
faded.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
He doesn't even get out of bed till...
And the expression that reverberates is that on the edge of the bed, he poked his toes towards his slipper
That's right.
and then withdrew it, thinking better of it.
I found that was the most ridiculous book. I thought he was a ridiculous fellow. I thought he was a character, some kind of fantasy idea of a person. I was bored reading about him. And I wasn't so sure he was authentic. I mean, I don't know who this author is, but it seems to me he had some idea of what a slothful... Did he have a political kind of agenda there? What was there something behind there? It seemed to me he was making some point.
We defer to the Russian amongst us, even though you are actually now a New Yorker.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was meant to be a sort of political comment. At the
Well,
time.
everything that any Russian wrote in the 19th century was meant to be political. Tsar
So what was he
bad.
trying to show? The author?
The indolence of this sort of upper class, the aristocracy of...
Okay, well,
of
see,
St.
that brings the
Petersburg.
point to me then. That's a rather cliched view of what sloth is, or laziness. The implication is if you're rich and don't need to work, you'll sit around contemplating your navel or putting your toe towards a slipper, and then the working classes aren't lazy and aren't slothful because they're forced to have to work day and night. And I think that's rather cliched. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean...
But except that was true, that did happen in the 1800s.
Maybe it did, but maybe that's not so easy. Maybe that's not necessarily the real definition of what laziness is. It seems to me, if I look at the Buddhist literature, which is it's different from the Catholic one. Well, no, the Catholic one was a bit insightful to me, that this laziness was avoiding doing what you should do. So being busy doing what you shouldn't do, being busy and avoiding what you should do, which looks like you're being busy, actually is a form of laziness. So engaging in what you should do, which of course they meant spiritual practice. And in the Buddhist literature, it's a bit similar. The first kind of laziness is can't be bothered. Maybe that's, the second kind though is I'm too busy, I'll do it later, which is called procrastination.
And that's a particular sin, is it?
Well,
Or
it's the one that avoiding doing what you need to do, the thing that you can't be bothered doing.
I think the funniest part of the book is the section that deals with his family background.
Yes.
And his sloth, his pathological laziness becomes clear. This is how he grew up. It was a big household, a gentry household,
Yes.
where people did nothing. People did absolutely nothing. They slept off the labour of the dinner and thinking of reasons not to exert the slightest effort. For example, remember they received a letter. It was very unusual for them to receive a letter. So they handled it and they discussed whose handwriting it might be, and they put it away for a year and brought themselves to open it because it might have required some effort, some response.
That's
procrastination, as
That's
you
your
said.
procrastination. And maybe for me, reading Oblomov, the biggest sin is just utter self-centeredness. Utter self-centeredness.
I would challenge you to think that it's a cliche because I think around the 1800s, I mean, Flaubert, Proust, all those guys were writing about decadent aristos and the upper middle class lazing around doing nothing.
And Chekhov went on to write 4 plays about the
them.
inability of the gentry
Yes.
to do anything to fix up their languishing estates.
But-
That's what it was all about. Every one of the great plays by Chekhov is about gentry that can't make the household work because they're inherently lazy. They've got this inherited laziness. By the way, the communists must have loved Oblomov. It
Yes.
must have been required reading after 1917.
Russian was so Oblomovian in the 20th century. It was a thing to behold. Just every relative I knew was asleep in his office from 9 to 4 with a slight break for vodka. Women worked hard. Women were building the streets and the crumbling mansions and everything, and the men were sort of these, these dreamers, if you will. And that's how I became slothful, is just learning from my ancestors.
But in the heritage of Russia, is Oblomov seen as a fascinating hero or, in fact, a reproach, an example of what you shouldn't be?
Well, both. To the new go-get-'em Muscovites who are, busy carving up slices of oil and gas that's very reprehensible. But to most of the working population, to be an Oblomov, I think, is still pretty cool.
I can't believe it. Wow.
I'd like to go back because, you were talking about in Buddhism, it's the origin was of not attending to your faith. The actual origin of sloth, I think, is really interesting because it used to be when it started. It was in the 4th century. It was known as the noonday demon, and it was these monks in the desert in Egypt, and because they weren't attending to their prayers, that was the sin of not being, sufficiently spiritually alert. But that became sadness or melancholia, and I think that's a really interesting link. That sloth and melancholia or sadness should be linked.
It was one of the humours. There's the 4 humours, and I forget which one the other 3 are, but they're much more humorous than melancholia.
Bile, I know, is in there.
Yeah.
Blood.
something like that. And you had to have balance of all of them. So you need parts of all of them in order to, you know, operate with balance. But if you overcompensate with one, and that's melancholy, you're just depressed, basically. And I just think it's a little bit uncaring of Christianity to just go, just do it, just snap out of it. You know, perhaps there's something missing for a reason, and you get sad. I think it's depression is what they pinpointed. And they're like, you know what, just swim in some snakes. It's not very caring, is it?
It's not very caring.
And snakes are, that's not a punishment for the sloth form, but to avoid being bitten by snakes, you just be very still.
The idea of melancholy as sort of an origin of sloth, does that ring true to you?
Yeah, you see it pop up a lot in art. It's either the representation of sloth is either just someone lounging on a chair. Hieronymus Bosch did a great one in his 7 Deadly Sins, or something that's slow like a snail. And I think that's unfair on the snails. They're practically backpacking, and that, you know, they're taking their house with them. That's, you know, they're just slow. Like, I think there's always this misconception that you're slothful because you're slow. But I think when you're slow, you're just picking your battles.
But then along comes the complete redefinition, where it becomes what we now think of it, which is kind of laziness which happens in about the 17th century. And look, Bob, I don't want to sound cynical, but that is also just in time for the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and the notion that a non-working widget is no point at all. Does it seem suggestive to you?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. It's been remarked on that the peasant class was able to get away with a lot of idle time. A lot of idle time. With the industrial era, another ethic, and you've got the view that there was the deserving poor, but idle people were not to be tolerated. So I think it is part of the rigour of the industrial age, that shift in view.
That would go to serve that, you know, over busy people get sad. You know, the pace is too much for some constitutions to cope with. I know it's too much for me. You know, just this having to work constantly and justify sitting. You have to be busy all the time. It's like, you know, if you don't have time to think, then you might, you know, it's a form of procrastination.
So speaking psychologically, which is really the basis of the Buddhist one, is that if we're avoiding what's going on inside here, we'll do anything but deal with what's inside here, which of course informs what you do out there. So we'll just run around looking like we're incredibly busy, putting it off, unable to bear what's going on inside yourself. This is why I'm thinking it's more nuanced than just lots of activity or no activity, is that it has to have some ethical basis. There's got to be you can be really busy doing lots of, you know, working really hard designing guns so you can go out and kill people. I mean, who cares?
But what about monastic life? How do you explain that in these terms?
Oh, absolutely. The Buddhist psychological approach, in the Buddhist model of the mind, we need to learn to go and see what's going on inside here, because obviously it's hardly rocket science, and Buddha doesn't own this idea that what goes on inside here informs what you do with your body and speech. And clearly it needs to be for the good of the world, for yourself and the others. It has got to be ethically based. And so if you know what's going on inside here, then that informs what you do with your body and speech, then it's useful. You mightn't be so busy, but then what you do is useful, because it leaves something useful. It's useful. It's
useful
beneficial to others.
Is meditation hard work?
Enormously hard.
Very tough discipline.
Unbelievable discipline. So, you know, you could have a person sitting there all day doing their meditation, not just some self-centered activity, but an activity of honing your own mind, disciplining. It needs immense rigour and discipline to focus your mind so that you can transform it, basically, and then become a better human being. I mean,
isn't that a fairly self-absorbed? You could argue,
if that's the reason you're doing it, just to become more self-absorbed. But you can't be more self-absorbed than Mr. Oblomov, could you? And it's useless anyway. The reason behind this is so that you can end up being useful to others.
Just before Oblomov, I like
Oblomov.
Oblomov was published, only but 5 short years, there was a book by Melville, Mr. Moby Dick Melville, who called Bartleby the Scrivener. This scrivener who went to work on Wall Street, and he did some good work for a while, and then he stopped working. And he would always say, I would prefer not to. Would you like to go and do some job? I would prefer not to. That was his answer to everything. And in the end, he got sacked, and in the end, he died. That's the story.
Right.
But...
Spoiler alert.
It's only a short story.
What's
the point is that people say this was the first literary example of extreme sloth, and it was about protest. So that's what I want to ask about. Is sloth, in fact, a form of protest, of being, whether you're sitting on Wall Street, over busy there, or whether you're out cutting down trees, or whether you're on a computer, is sloth some kind of strike?
Well, it must have been in the old Soviet Union. The workers saw that they were stuck in a system that exploited them grotesquely. If they weren't party leadership, they didn't have decent rations. And one response to a system that was ripping them off was to sell on the black market anything they could steal out of the factory, and to do no work whatsoever themselves. That's
the old joke was, you pretend to pay us, we pretend to work.
Yeah. So it could be argued it was a rational response.
Oh, very rational, I think.
Why should they exert themselves, given that the party leadership was exploiting the system?
Well, sometimes when you're feeling there's an element of being trapped in a situation, whether it be political or whatever, and your response is sloth, that can affect you spiritually. And so then it becomes a lot denser in that way, in that it will make you sad, because, you know, that's pretty much what it goes back to. It's like, maybe it's not so conscious in some levels, the sloth. You're just like there's not a lot of point, because you're hitting your head against a wall, and so you become...
I think it's an expression of get me away from all this.
Yeah, you're damaged on some level. So on the Christian sense, where it's, you know, you're supposed to basically be thinking about God and you're thinking about everything else, that's sloth. Like, or you think about nothing, you don't care. But, you know, in a state of depression, that's essentially what you do. You are empty. You're not even sad, you're empty. Like, you just can't get off the couch, you're not... There's no humour, there's just... Nothing gives you joy. And that's not necessarily a protest, it's almost a defence.
It is one answer to Hamlet's question, to be or not to be, to take up arms against a sea of troubles and blah, 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 in them. The slothful person, preeminently our mate Oblomov, opts just to stay on the couch all day. If you consider that all social action ends up being useless, counterproductive, that everything ends in paradox or defeat, I suppose you could argue that's one response.
Do you really believe it?
No, I don't believe it. I couldn't live that way, and I'd feel like slapping his face or shaking him around to get him started. But you can understand, there's a philosophic grandeur about someone who says, it is all useless, I'm not even going to attempt it, I'll just lie on the couch till a stroke takes me out.
Exactly, and that's a protest.
A friend of Oblomov says to him, dude, Oblomov, you know, you should be reading more books. That's what it's all about. And Oblomov says, these books, they're just for the self-glorification of the author. And that's the kind. So he's saying he wants to take himself out of that, and he doesn't have anything to glorify about himself. So he's just going to live the rest of his life and then die. You know, at the end of each in his family, this genteel family in the countryside, they end each day by crossing themselves and saying, "Well, that's another day over with. Thank God." You know, and that's a beautiful kind of mantra. You know, they survived another day, and now another day begins, and then...
It's practical psychology. It's
self-care. Like, it
yes.
Perpetuates something. Like, if you're happy and balanced on the inside, then that expression will help. Like, just in your own life. Like, he's not happy, this guy.
Clearly.
Oblomov.
That's right.
Had a go, swallowed the word.
No one would opt to live like that, surely. I mean, it's repellent to me, but
Horrible.
I can see the logic of it. Looking at the
You would
universe,
no more go to bed and lie there and fly to the moon.
No, drive me insane, but I'd rather be in a life of pointless activism and busyness. It just seems to give you a chance of having a shot at doing something.
No, it's true.
Pulling
I
something
agree
off.
with that.
But
That's a good point.
I can just see the logic of his radical view of the universe.
Okay.
Nothing works, everything fails, everything's counterproductive. It's a correct reading of the situation in Russia, of course, so why not stay in bed?
I feel a bit like it now.
not this minute.
No, not in the show, just generally in this country.
Really. I want to give you a bit of fresh meat on the literary front in terms of sloth. Ignatius J. Riley, the lead character in A Confederacy of Dunces. I'm not saying he's slothful, but he was someone who never wanted to leave the place of his birth. And he was pretty damn shambling, wasn't he?
Big fella.
Would you put him into the sloth category?
The story is basically him living with his mom, and then he meets a woman. There's a love interest in Oblomov as well. So the love interest always exists in these books. The large fella in bed has to be aroused by something. And so it's him. I know that, yes, the lifting of the eyes is appropriate at that point. And so he tries to get out of bed, and then things don't happen, I think. I can't remember how the book ended.
Look, he's just this big, shambolic bear of a man who just thinks that everybody is far too active, far too busy, and does very little, does extremely little. Because it's quite hard in literature to find creatures that don't do anything.
Well, you need action. You need some kind of narrative drive. I like, you talk to me at the end of the day, not interesting. What I've done, what I've achieved in action. Thought a lot, but...
What do you mean, Hannah?
Well, just action-wise, like if I'm going to drive a narrative, I'm not going to drive a narrative.
There's no arc to your day.
No, there's no arc to my day. So that's why slothful people don't make great central characters.
So do you feel
there's no action? I don't need to have action. I'm living a life. But as far as literature is concerned, you need someone who's doing shit. I'm not doing shit.
It's so nice you can say shit here. Holy shit.
These small civil liberties are granted to you.
This is how a civilization is made. And not a shitty civilization either, a fine one.
So does your quietness and slowness, but activity within, get mistaken as sloth? Is it something you feel a little defensive about?
Oh, not defensive. I love my lifestyle. I get lots done, but I don't get heaps done. I'm not constantly busy. I pick my battles.
Thomas Pynchon, in an essay on sloth, he actually wrote an essay called "Nearer My Couch to Thee," which I like. And he said that he described writers specifically as mavens of sloth, the ones who they're the expert witnesses at the sloth hearings. They're the head of the sloth task forces. Is it, do you think, an especially writerly sin?
The thing is that really good writing, you do it for 3 hours a day and it's diminishing returns after that. So truly to write requires 3 hours a day. So, I wake up at 11, breakfast is brought in, that's until 12, then the writing day begins until 3, and that's it. And then then we all get together for well, first there's psychoanalysis until 5. Then we all have dinner at a Viennese cafe on Park Ave until 7. Then drinking until 12. And then what's called the crying hour, which is when writers realize that publishing is dead and we're all going to be homeless soon enough. And then 11 more hours of sleep, koala-like. And then the cycle begins again at 11 with breakfast and then the 3-hour work. But it's not because I'm lazy.
You are such a liar.
No, it's all true.
There's
Just follow my
said
tweet feed.
about creativity flowing in the stiller states. Like, I do a lot of my best thinking just before I go to sleep and just after I've woken up. But if you just jump out of bed and just get busy, you lose that.
So you really meant it? You do some of your best work in bed?
My best thought, I do.
Great.
I do sort of sit there and let my brain be active in its own time. I mean, I have that, I'm privileged enough to be able to do that. I'm not, but I'm saying it's actually a really key part of my creativity.
So not to be mistaken with sloth.
Well, I have passion, so I don't think I'm guilty of sloth. I have passion about inactivity, though. So
my best work as a premier was done leaping out of bed, not having time to arrange my thoughts, and picking up the phone to morning radio stations, newsrooms, and shaping the political agenda of the day. The less thought I gave it, the better it worked. And inspired by the ruminations of my sleeping state, great ideas came to the fore. I'd only have to hear a burst of the 5:30 a.m. news to decide how I'd reshape things.
My goodness.
And would appear on the 6 a.m. or the 6:30 a.m. news.
it's a very different thing, though, that,
It was creative. It was like your stuff. It was being entertaining,
I'm not ruling the world.
Putting
but
suggestions out there,
just making jokes.
making decisions and telling some jokes.
Here's a proposition for you, that we're all talking like sloth isn't such a bad thing, really. You know, it takes many forms and, or it can be redefined as you are, Robina. But my proposition is that because it is the only sin of omission on the list, all of the others are sins of commission, too much lust, too much anger, so forth. Because it's the sin of omission, if sloth gets in your spirit, then basically it's like the cruise missile of the sins. All the others go, but in fact everything goes. It can blow up everything and leave emptiness in its wake.
Cluster bomb. I don't think sloth is necessarily a sin. It's not a state to aspire to, but I think that if it happens, it's symptomatic. It's not, you know, it's symptomatic of something else, whether it be sadness, despair, these sorts of things. I think that's like it becomes a form of, you know, whether it be public protest or internal protest, you know, if you feel despondency.
And so one should, rather than judging and condemning,
Just look after yourself. Just look after yourself, right? Self-care is what it goes into. I think there's a lot of... So people like to condemn other people. I think that's not the problem.
I think lust is okay in small quantities.
Yeah.
But that's a sin of commission, even in small quantities.
Or emission, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just despondency and sadness and hopelessness, isn't it? That's what.
Yeah.
It's the worst one. It means you're worthless, and what you do is worthless, which is the exact opposite. Reality, I think, is opposite. Every single being has some worth. I'm trying to be sentimental or holy here. Every single one of us has enormous worth and potential. So to have in this particular way we're talking here, the Buddhist view, the first level of laziness is can't be bothered, too much effort. The second one is I'm too busy, I'll put it off. But the third one is the worst. It's the one that says I'm not capable, I can't do it. And that, I think, informs all the rest.
In the end, life is meaningful
That's right.
only when we make a contribution.
Exactly.
You've got to contribute.
Yes.
And as meaningless as the whole thing looks from time to time, the one answer is, what can I contribute today?
Totally.
To my family, to my neighbourhood, to the world?
Even just
what can my contribution be?
Even to the dog
and
next
so
door.
I really think I could give some good therapy to Oblomov. I think I could appear in
But
that.
I would put it this way, that I think the Oblomov in our own Oblomov, I've got to start moving my Oblomov, you know. We'll forget Mr. Oblomov, that's his problem. But every one of us has to see that we've got this potential. Every one of us can see that we can be of use to the world, even as just the dog next door.
A most intriguing sin, this one. It's actually a harder sin to pin down because we live with it, but it's all in the definition and all in the way we think about it.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Get me back here for greed. Ooh,
We've done greed.
I guess that's anger. Oh, no, no.
That is our show for tonight. It was great to have, and I hope you will join me giving a big thank you to tonight's guests, to Bob, to Hannah, to Gary, and to Robina. Now, next week, we tackle envy. Its colour is... Yeah.
I wanted to do that one. That was a little joke I did there about envy.
Oh, I get it now. I'm so slow.
Moving on. Its
Envy.
colour is green. Of course it's green. Its associated animal is the dog, and the punishment in hell is to be put in freezing water. So until then, take care, be thankful for what you've got. That was my envy joke, but yours is better.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for your company. Lovely to have you. Good night.